the use of your lower half would be fabulous. But the point is, we're going to be losing an existing access point for about a decade in the interim. And I just wanted to make sure that's the plan. I hadn't heard anything on schedule in your presentation.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that is still being worked out, Owen, but we absolutely hear you. And I think as we move forward, we'll have a better sense of how that construction sequencing is going to shake out, but absolutely noted. And we'll make sure to hit upon that point next time. Thank you. Right, a bunch of hands raised. Jean, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Jean and I live in Carroll Gardens. And I just wanted to make an observation that the presentation on the salt shed, I have to say, it seemed kind of brutalist. You know, I mean, yeah, we want to be in the character of the neighborhood, but it, you know, if there could be some lightness or whimsy or humor or decorativeness to the design, I don't think that would make it horribly out of character, or that people would object. It's just a reaction.
Thank you, Jean. Irene, would you like to go next?
You know, I like in general the access to the waterfront, but having kayaked and having done rowboating, how would you actually access the kayak launch? Do people drive up and take the kayak over there, or is there a boathouse? How does it all work?
That's a great question. So we're still figuring out what kind of facilities might go along with the floating dock itself and the launch. But Anna, do you want to just walk through briefly sort of the thoughts about the grading and the experience in that in the 6th Street turning basin?
Sure. So 6th Street and 2nd Avenue are they're about at elevation 7.5 or so, and the water elevation, of course, fluctuates with the tides. And so the key kind of point to the design is that it needs to be there needs to be some kind of gangway or some kind of approach that can allow a floating dock that can change with the tidal elevations, and to account for sea level rise. So those are all things we're looking at designing. We haven't fully, as Alicia mentioned, we haven't fully designed kind of how that approach works exactly, but we are making sure that it would all be ADA accessible, so you would be able to access the kayak launch.
Would people walk through the demonstration gardens to
That's the
take
idea.
the boat? Oh, that is a little awkward. And the demonstration gardens are sort of in an odd place.
Well, I think.
Where do you think they would be better?
That's a good question.
Well, that's a good question, but if you come with a car and your boat, it's difficult to walk through the whole gardens, and then you might have to still move your car. You know, it's
Okay, that's really helpful. That's really helpful feedback, Irene, for sure. I mean, I think what Anna's trying to explain is that pathway zigzags so that it can make the grade change, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no boathouse.
We haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah.
We had several years to figure everything out.
Owen's asking about hours of operations. Again, we don't know yet, Owen. Okay.
But hearing those spatial comments were really helpful, like hearing what you think, what you see here is working well or not working well. It'd be great to get into that, even start sketching. Thanks, Harsha.
Great. Andrea, do you want to go? And if you've already asked your question, if you don't mind putting your hand down so I don't recall on you. But if you have another question, you can keep it up.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask the question that Celeste asked in the chat, because I think that we've got a good group of people here also to talk about the Second Avenue street end, which I do think that currently the design is kind of a missed opportunity. That is like one of the most magical places on the canal, where there has long been, at least a get down to the waterway. I think that I understand that it's not possible to have an ADA accessible access there, but like what could be possible in order to have something to get at least emergency access to the canal there? And what are the constraints?
Yeah, so among some of the constraints, and I don't have like a tremendous amount of detail here, but among some of the constraints are the tide gates that are there. Then those are related to the CSO facility. So we've got our CSO infrastructure there. There's also a need to provide vehicular access, not just for our trucks, but also I think Department of Corrections needs to be able to turn there. Thank you. Where Harshat put the little, oh, look at that. I love this Miro thing. I think the Post-it notes are so cute. So it's a little bit more of a tricky area because you've got that overlay with infrastructure, which you don't have in other places. We're very fortunate on this site that there are a lot of places that are kind of a little bit, that are just much more open, and we're not trying to layer public access over top, CSO infrastructure as much as we had to do at the head end. So there's a lot more opportunity here, but we do have those moments where they're sort of pinch points. And that's an area, we're absolutely hearing from a bunch of folks that we need to take a closer look at and see what can be done. But I just want to, remind people that there is a lot going on below ground there.
Where are the tide gates exactly? Like, could you draw out on here exactly where the infrastructure is?
Anna's pointing at them, but there's also the font thing is showing up. There you go. There they are. There and there. So that's why we're sort of looking at a more paved plaza solution there. Yeah.
But the infrastructure is no longer going to be in the street itself, right?
Under Second Avenue, you mean?
Yeah, like the way the CSO outfall is right now under Second Avenue.
Right. So
it will no longer be there.
I think I'm correct in saying this. Correct me if I'm wrong, project team, but we're intercepting that, and the flow will go through the facility, and then it has to have, an outlet, but it will be located further west.
We're definitely looking at how we can lower this edge so that either emergency access or more ways to get closer to the water. We're still just really early in this part. So thank you for mentioning that, because we are definitely trying to get this lower. It'd be great to hear what types of things you would like to see to do with a get down there, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. All right, if nobody wants to comment there yet, or maybe Ariel, do you want to speak?
Yeah, hi. Maybe this was talked about in the first session, which I did not attend, but given, well, two things. Since this is a very, we're looking at the public realm, as you said, of this very public space, 1.8 acres of it, at the end of Second Avenue, which is part of the IBZ. So it's really conceptually more connected to the other side of the canal, which has been rezoned for housing and for some light industrial. So, and particularly, I think towards the west right there is a new park. So have you done a study that, brings that back? I mean, I know you have. It would be nice to see that study, because it seems to me, and people have commented on this in different ways, that right now to get here, you have to come through the IBZ and come through Second Avenue, when you should be able to get there from the other side very easily. And I don't know what those constraints are. Maybe that's one of your constraints, is how to access across the canal. But it seems to me that would be an incredibly helpful thing, whether that's little ferries that cross the canal, because you have a couple of other places where the bulkheads are lowered, or whether it's an actual bridge or the sponge park or whatever things they are that you can cross the canal, so you don't have to come all the way around.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have discussed pedestrian bridges in the past. It's not part of our project scope at this time. You know, we can't. There's nothing. The plan is not to do anything that would preclude that in the future. I really love the idea of a little ferry service, though. Dredgers, are you up for it?
Absolutely.
All right, Celeste, go ahead.
I was just going to respond to some of the Second Avenue comments. Andrea sort of got at my initial question, but in response to your prompt, in that street end is pretty heavily used by lots of people for fishing and for sort of small boat access to the canal today. And one of the advantages of it is that it is at a street end. So people bring cars in with their private boats. So it's not a boathouse. It's not a sort of like publicly managed or run by an organization like ours, but it is very frequently used by pretty broad swaths of the community at that spot. I think one of the things that would be enormously helpful there would not necessarily be, you know, big, robust infrastructure that needs to be built as much as you know, lowered bulkheads so that people can kind of make their own fun with that edge, which is an important part of kind of recreational access on the water.
Celeste, can you describe a little bit more about how people are getting their boats to that site?
Yeah, driving down and sort of parking along the Second Avenue. For a while, there was a boat that was just sort of like tied up there, up on the shore, so it was crowded in the rocks, but mostly people driving their cars down and with a boat strapped on top, dropping them into the water at that point, because you can just sort of slide it down over the edge of the rocks. And that sort of turnaround point that exists down there makes a kind of perfect spot for that. And it doesn't seem to have caused any problems for any of the other uses, as far as I know.
Thank you.
The other question that I had similarly was on the access to the site. I mean, a lot of this stuff is set back from the street pretty far out. So will it be gated, or is there an intention to sort of like limit access hours for the overlap between IBZ and the kind of lack of eyes on the street feel to it? Because that does concern me about the kayak launch, if that's the case.
Sorry, I missed a little bit of the beginning of your question.
Oh, like, is it intended for this to be closed at certain hours of the day, given the uses of it and where it is in the neighborhood, or would it be open access at all? And I know you don't know because you're not programming it, but that is a kind of design feature, right? Is like, is this intended to be fenced and gated off?
A gate, yeah.
Because then you're sort of limiting access at the 6th Street turning basin, when today that street end access is available at all hours of the day, which is another advantage that it has. Lots of people are out at totally different hours of the day on the water.
Okay, that's a really great comment. Thank you for that feedback. I'm just trying to read through the chat, which is really hard to do while also listening, so I apologize. Okay. Nicole, are you clear? Did we clarify things for you?
Well, you were talking about the different title things, and you were pointing at sort of this Canal Plaza, and I was just not sure why having those tidal gates at the Canal Plaza precluded having access at the Second Ave and where it is currently. That's, you know, just what I was wondering.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, I think one of the most complex parts of this project is the grading. Because you've got Second Avenue at a certain elevation. And then I think, as Kevin mentioned very early in our presentation, to build these new city facilities, we need to be building them in a resilient manner, right? And so that means making sure that all of the like electrical is like out of the floodplain, right? So one of the biggest challenges, but also I think one of the greatest opportunities for this site is about thinking about how that grade change works, and that grade change can be experiential for people. But it also lends, you know, a certain level of challenge to be as flexible in some places than others, because of, sort of the way that the underground infrastructure is working and connecting to the above ground infrastructure. We can definitely get more detail about that, but that's sort of my general understanding. And I hope that that makes sense the way that I explained it.
Yeah, it does. But I guess one thing, you keep saying the ADA accessibility, which is wonderful. And I think that that's a fantastic thing to have. I think, your focus of having that at the kayak launch is amazing, the 6th Street turning basin. But I don't think that that should preclude having other access points that are open other times and not gated.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Can't see everybody all of a sudden. Hang on. Anyone have their hand raised?
I'm having trouble seeing the hands too, but I'd love to hear.
Andrea, you have a hand? It's the same color as the wall behind you.
Right.
It's really hard to see.
Yeah, and I know I already spoke. I just wanted to respond to another one of your questions was, what are you most excited about? And I would say, I love the amount of wetland that you're including here. I think that's incredible. I mean, we've seen that this site that Salt Marsh is so happy at this site already, and I love creating more of that. I also would just make a plug for mussel habitat in particular. We're working with the dredgers to experiment with mussel habitat in the canal. As you know, a lot of it was wiped out by all this bulkheads. So figuring out how to make textures within here that can support mussels, something I would really recommend. And even if it's like along the hard steel bulkhead, if there are, e-concrete or other textures that can be applied to the steel bulkhead to provide habitat for mussels.
Cool, that's great. Do you want to look at the questions again, Anna? Get people thinking.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'd love to hear more about some of the elevations of access to the water, and kind of more of the design criteria that you would love to see for access to the water. Is that too vague? I also don't know. It seems like there's not that many people. Maybe people can just speak.
Can you just sort of repeat the question that you're asking?
I would just love to know more about the elevation of the bulkhead and kind of like the requirements that you were speaking about for.
Yeah, I think Owen can speak to this slightly better than I can, but at the 2nd Street dock that the dredgers operate over at 365 Bond, the bulkhead elevation there is actually -1, I believe, because then it sort of provides that edge, but you can slide a boat over it, and that's been great. So things that are below height are wonderful in our view, particularly. Obviously, the walkway is above that.
How do people feel about an amphitheater facing Bond Street? Saw a shrug.
We
No one
hosted
likes it?
actually an arts event there with GCC, where we placed a projection screen and showed an artist film of people floating in water on that edge facing Bond, and it was pretty fun to be able to look across. So I like that, except for, that street end across Bond has a pretty significant impact on how cool that interface is, depending on what's happening with the access at that site and what the sort of visual barrier is. There is a very ugly and obstructing fence at the moment.
I think that's a good point, that it did face the other side where people are more likely to be walking by than facing down Canal, where you're not going to get as much visual interest from people walking by who want to come over and like make the trek around, find their nearest bridge and come over and see what the space is. If you could, you know, make sure that it's visible from the side where there's going to be more walk by would be great. The same thing with the Whole Foods space. That's the other great thing about Second Ave is that folks over at Whole Foods walking along that whole promenade, it's really visible from there. So there's a lot of interaction across the canal from there.
Yeah, that Second Avenue spot like activates the whole food space into for sure.
Yeah, so like making that like a very clearly like a signal that like this is also like public walkway and
Yeah,
public
exactly.
space.
You were talking about reorienting the amphitheater to face where people are walking. Could you help us draw out where
I
you
think
mean?
I was looking at your community gathering space that was facing down Canal, so I was looking
Oh,
at the
great.
wrong space.
That's fine. That's fine. So let's talk about the community gathering looking down the canal, you were saying.
And I would
I-
actually
I-
disagree with you, Nicole, because I actually think that from Public Place and the new park that's going to be across the canal, there's so much of a view of this. And I feel like one of the beauties of having the tip be so open is that there's going to be a lot of high density development, and this will sort of expand the view shed that you can see.
What I meant more is because it's looking, or at least on my screen, down this way to just make sure that it's also visible from the side. Not that it should change orientation, but just making sure that it's not blocked by anything that would prevent you from seeing it from the side. That's all.
from the side over here where we're drawing. Visible from over here. Great.
Okay, we've got about 10 more minutes.
I'll chime in just because I was having technical difficulties. I did put a bunch of things in the chat, but the number one issue when we used Second Avenue for a number of years was that people would spot you from the bridge, and then they would be engaged with the soon to be clean waters, of which DEP should be proud of. Second, the public access from the street is critical because they can see you as they look down the avenue, and that there's an event, something happening. There's some tents, some flags. If there was a shade structure there, all the better. If there was a fishing station, even better. A fish cleaning station would be wonderful. You know, those kinds of things activate our streets, and we've done this throughout New York Harbor. I don't know why the city would be choosing to remove a space that is historically a community amenity for the Gowanus as they try to improve things. I completely endorse adding a second, but removal just doesn't make any sense.
Jean asks, what happens to the salt in the salt shed if there's a serious flood? What provision is being made to contain the salt in an emergency? That's an excellent question. So as I mentioned, we're going to be grading up those spaces, so they'll be higher and out of the floodplain. But there's also essentially retaining walls, right? Those site walls that run along the side of the yard. All of the salt will be contained within the structure, but the yard is where they store the plow blades and some other stuff that they have. And it's a big part of how they drive that little front loader in and up there. So that shouldn't be an issue. Celeste is currently in Chicago. Yes.
Can I also answer the salt question as well? Just in the last iteration of building the salt shed and the compost facility, they were required to put in a lot of green infrastructure to manage, and like way over engineer green infrastructure to manage any overflow. So I believe you're going to have to do the same thing here.
Thanks, Andrea.
I'd love to hear what people would like to do on a programmed deck in the 6th Street turning basin. not to cut anyone off, but I would love to just kind of brainstorm more
What
with you all
wouldn't we
about
like to do?
Playing
would you-
charades.
is this a good spot for
dominoes.
this? What do you want to do here? Are you going to use this if we do this here or not?
That's
Are you going to put grills there? Because then people will use it.
Depends on the opening hours too. Like Owen keeps asking, you know, how much is it going to be gated? Because I could see that being a really good early morning bird spot. But if it doesn't open until 10 o'clock, not so useful for folks who have to make it to their 9 to 5s.
Yeah. Celeste, you still have a hand up? No.
I just took it down. I mean, I
Feel free to
I
check.
do think that the grill thing, and like, I know that's not the kind of primary use that a lot of this stuff is designed for, but in terms of getting people in and access to it, one of the things that I think the dredgers have found really important is creating lots of entry points for people to engage with environmental issues and opportunities and questions. And so things that people know they like hanging out and grilling with their family and friends, do create entry points for people to learn about this kind of infrastructure and the things that it can do. So keeping them totally segregated sometimes can run kind of counter. And that is a thing that lots of folks in the larger community have repeatedly requested at shoreline park amenities throughout the entire rezoning process.
Okay, thanks.
That's helpful.
Will there be public restrooms in this space? Because that is something we're severely lacking in the city as a whole. But, you know, if we're trying to have a kayak launch and all these demonstration gardens and all of this stuff, will there be a public restroom?
That is a great note. We'll look into that.
Sorry.
Great. You want to zoom out, Anna, so people can see the full? Yeah. Or sorry, who is in control of this? Rashad, sorry. All right, any other thoughts? Outdoor classroom at the point, tidal wetland, community gathering, different lookout areas. We talked a little bit about view corridors. That was really helpful.
So are there going to be like in a community gathering and amphitheater simultaneously performances or different activities happening? What's the difference between community gathering and amphitheater?
That's a good question. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
I think, yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Well, you know, in this initial concept, we're trying to mitigate some of the grade changes that Alicia mentioned, especially with the amphitheater. It has to be very high here with the shared street. And we're trying to bring people lower out to the water. So that seemed like a great complementary use there. But we're not imagining that you couldn't have activity at both places, but we also haven't gotten into that level of detail.
Because I mean, I know there's an opera group on Smith Street, and they used to do opera performances in docks where the steel dock workers are, you know, with all the, it was a great event. Or they did it on a tugboat performance that was parked in Red Hook. And now we don't, due to security, this opera group, it's not out there performing in Carroll Gardens. I mean, they're located in Carroll Gardens, but I would love to. It was fun seeing opera outdoors, and would the amphitheater provide such a space for such a group, or the community center, whatever it's going to be? I mean, it was a summer event, but you know, it was a great thing to have during the every summer to anticipate this different opera. which I had videoed, but it needs editing to promote the group's intent. I mean, because I get opera people from all over Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan to do performances there. I mean, and when the project was around. You've never heard of the Vertical Repertory Group, opera group? No.
Is that the name of the group?
Yeah, the Vertical Repertory or Vertical Opera Repertory on Smith Street. It's a woman, Julie Barnes, who runs this storefront. She lives in the storefront on Smith Street. No,
We can look.
Oh no, Court Street. I'm sorry, it's Court Street.
You're bringing up a great point about scale and the scale of each of these zones, and that's definitely something we need to look at kind of as a next step, getting into each of these program zones and thinking about how many people could use this, what type of event could a certain space support. So we'll look at the vertical.
Juliet Barnes,
Yeah.
Vertical Repertory Theater.
We will watch this and make sure we get the name. Then we will get the name and take a look. And others, there's so many performance groups around the canal. I think we are about to get kicked out.
They're basically in warehouses. I mean, but those warehouses are being destroyed by developers anyway.
So I think we're about to get put back into the main room where we'll discuss our next steps. But I think that all of this feedback's been really tremendously helpful, and I will thank everybody, but I want to thank all of you. And there we go. Hi. Oh wait, we didn't go back.
I think we have to click leave room.
Okay,
It
we have to
wasn't.
click leave room. I got confused when the Miro board disappeared. All right. So click leave room, and we'll all join back together to discuss next steps in the main room. All right, I'll see you on the other side.